Steve Kerr goes down at home against Cleveland by like 22. The cutoff's 20, and they send me anyway. And he goes, "What the hell, Doris?" Like, "You're not supposed to do this." And he ends up saying something about it in the postgame, like, "I feel so bad." And I'm like, "Hey, I didn't take it personally. Don't stress."
It's the Boris Dirk podcast. Max's knee recovery is somewhere between 2011 Adrian Peterson and 2023 Lonzo Ball. We are back, and we want to talk about the names that are on Get Up right now, if Get Up even still exists, the names of guys that are likely to be traded in the near term, or at least tell their agents that they want out. These are Dame, DeAndre Ayton, Jaylen Brown, Tyler Herro, Karl Anthony Towns, James Harden. We want to talk about where these guys could possibly go and all the different teams that are in the mix. We're going to start with Dame, but before you tell me your favorite Dame landing spot, Max, how are you?
I'm doing well. The knee is coming along. I've got some increase in my degrees of flexion. But yeah, a lot of time on the couch watching Summer League and cooking up fake trades. So doing okay.
We've been talking a lot about 2-team, 3-team trades, and we wanted to figure out a good format to bring them onto the pod just because the trade machine is our favorite place to be right now. It's definitely hard as a listener to follow along with some of these big deals we've been imagining, conceptualizing. So we're going to do our best to slow it down for you. Max is the first person I talked to after Dame requested his trade, who really liked the idea of Dame going to Toronto. And it makes a lot of sense to me. Toronto has a ton of picks and a lot of really good players, even post Fred VanVleet. So Max, I know you had a Dame to Toronto deal. You haven't shown it to me yet. What are you thinking?
Yes. So the most direct Dame to Toronto, just 2-team trade. And I think Dame makes a lot of sense for Toronto because on offense, he's kind of like a supercharged Fred VanVleet. He can give them shooting and, the rest of their sort of length and athleticism can cover up for some of his defensive deficiencies. But the most straightforward one is OG, Gary Trent, and Christian Koloko, who I like as a sort of center prospect, along with 3 Toronto firsts later in the 2020s for Dame. And that leaves Toronto with a starting lineup of something like Dame, Grady Dick, Scotty Barnes, Pascal Siakam, and Jakob Poeltl, which, might not be as good as their 2019 championship team, but I think it's better than the Lowry DeRozan years and probably puts them as a top 4 team in the East with a chance to compete to make a run if things really hit right with Dame and Pascal as the second star and the potential for Scotty to keep improving as a young prospect. So I really like Toronto for Dame. I think they have the combination of kind of player assets and the ability to trade 3 firsts to actually kind of entice Portland. And I think, if Dame really thought about it, he might come around to the idea of that team being a contender. But what do you think of that package of OG and then, salary, Trent, Koloko, and the 3 first-round picks?
Yeah, I'm doing it for the picks because as good as OG is, I just find it hard to believe that our team will be good enough to get the most out of him because OG is like a built for the playoffs kind of guy. So I might even do that deal and then reroute OG somewhere else like Memphis, a team that could use him now. But I love the picks. In my heart, I feel like Masai Ujiri is not going to pull the trigger on that kind of deal because even though Dame and Pascal Siakam are on similar timelines and they'd be a really good tandem, and Siakam has already expressed interest in staying in Toronto, I know that Ujiri views Scotty Barnes as the future of that team. And in a Blazers Raptors negotiation, the Blazers are going to be begging for Grady Dick to be involved. And the Raptors will say no because they drafted him because they really like him. And Joe Cronin's scared to go back to Blazers fans and say, look, I got you these 3 decent first rounders and a really good wing defender who belongs on a winning team, even though we're going to be in the lottery again next year. So I think it's a tough sell for my Masai Ujiri behind closed doors. And it's a tough sell to Blazers fans in the public sphere. I'm kind of shitting on the idea of bringing OG Anunoby into a really young team, but a lot of Blazers fans want to have good players right now. They want to see Dame turn into guys that are going to be above average contributors immediately and not just picks or rookies they've never heard of. So that's why if I were the GM of the Blazers, I'd be despised, because
Yeah.
I have in my mind, I have been looking at deals involving the Hawks where we could steal Kobe Buffkin, we could steal Onyeka Okongwu, maybe even give a second life to DeAndre Hunter, who, even though he makes 20 million a year, is still an interesting toolsy forward. But I think you'd actually be appeasing, especially the older Blazers fans who don't want to watch them suck for a couple of years, because if Scoot is sort of the Derrick Rose, Russie type, like ready-made elite athlete point guard that we think he is, the Blazers might be decent pretty soon, especially if Shaedon takes a step, and maybe they're able to get more out of OG Anunoby's prime than I'm imagining. It's definitely an interesting one. And again, those are good picks. Assuming Dame doesn't make the Raptors like one of the best teams in the league and suddenly we're picking in the 20s.
Right. But the picks are going to be like 26, 28, like 2026, 2028, 2030. So particularly by the time those last two picks roll around, Dame may not even be in the league anymore. So I think that's a solid package if you can get those picks unprotected. I mean, Masai's shown an ability to keep Toronto competitive for long periods of time. And then also, you can have OG on the team for the first half of the year, and then teams always around the trade deadline, they get kind of desperate to see how they can try to upgrade before a playoff run. There's probably a lot of teams in the West or the East who would be interested in adding OG to try to, beef up their front court rotation heading into the playoffs. So I feel like that's another asset which could spin, either to Memphis for another first or two, or a first and a swap, or to all sorts of teams. OKC, the Lakers could get involved. Well, probably not the Lakers, but a lot of teams would want him. So that could be a package which ends up netting you 4 or even 4.5, 5 first round picks. So that's why I like the Toronto one. I have another one which is much more straightforward. Apologies to our Nets fan listeners. It's Dame for Ben Simmons for contract purposes, Dariq Whitehead as sort of a young prospect flyer, and all the picks your heart desires from whether they're from Phoenix or Philadelphia or wherever else the Nets have picks coming from. But it would basically just be for the picks.
Yeah, I like it. I mean, they're great picks. The Nets, especially if they trade Bridges at some point, because he's older than you think. He was like 23 as a rookie. So now I think he's like 28 subtly. The Nets could be bad, and a lot of their picks, depending on which ones they are, because I know they have picks from other teams, but Nets picks are generally good assets to have, I think, in the next few years. I like it. I would actually I would take one fewer first and to take Nick Claxton if I could, just to give Scoot a run and jump athlete that helps them play like a real NBA team in Scoot's first couple of years. But I do like the idea of taking on Ben Simmons, not because I want to try to salvage his career. I don't have much hope for that at this point, but I do feel like the team that absorbs Ben Simmons' contract is probably going to win long term, because the Nets know they're going to have to sweeten the deal to get off of him. And this is the liberation of not being good in the near term and being willing to suck, is we can take on Kyle Lowry, we can take on Ben Simmons. We could even take on Van Vliet if the Rockets had buyer's remorse. There are just so many options for a team that doesn't want to be good. It's so fun. But yeah, I would definitely be down to take all those Nets picks, and I might also just want to flip them into something to make Scoot feel more at home from day one, because we've seen the repercussions. LaMelo just got 260 million, but it can't be good for a young leader to inherit a team that has zero impetus to win. So I'm fine with us sliding deeper into the lottery than the front office probably wants us to in the next 2 to 3 years. If it means that we're scraping out wins and our young guys are showing things, that's auspicious for us.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe Scoot's a good enough culture guy from day one that he can kick Ben Simmons into shape.
Yeah.
That I don't know if Michael Jordan could do that.
How do you feel about Damian Lillard's value in general? Because I wanted to ask you, I kept wanting to annoy you with a Dame to the Knicks trade, but it doesn't make sense with Brunson. No. But I was imagining a world where the Knicks had swung and missed on Brunson like they do with most guys, and how Dame in the Brunson role, how that would have looked. Do they beat the Cavs? It's silly to go back in time, but Are you excited about getting Dame, or do you feel like any team that trades for Dame is losing the deal because he's going to be in his mid-30s and the Blazers value him more than anyone else will? Like, what are your thoughts?
I don't think any team getting Dame is losing the deal. I think there are teams that can get Dame where it doesn't make sense. I think if you're trading for Dame, you have to be at least a conference finals contender with him for it to be worth it. He's 32, which is actually, for some reason, I thought he was more like 34, but 32 is not crazy. So I still expect him to have 2 or 3 years at an all NBA level. We've seen the way Steph is aged as an elite shooter, getting up to 35 years old and playing arguably his best basketball this past season. So I could see Dame aging similarly. Last year was the best statistical season of his career, probably. And if you put him in an environment where you have guys who can cover up for some of his deficiencies defensively, which is why I like Toronto particularly, I think, it makes sense to acquire him. I think he makes zero sense in Portland. So I think if they can actually trade him for a good package, that is better for them in the short and long term.
Yeah.
But I don't think, like Bradley Beal, for instance, I was much lower on his value just because of his injury concerns. He hasn't really been close to that all NBA level for a couple years now, and his contract pays him as an all NBA player. Dame, I think, is still pretty clearly one of the 10 to 12 best players in the NBA, 15 if you're like really nitpicky on his defense, but he's one of the best players in the NBA, one of the best players at his position. And yeah, I mean, selfishly, I want to see him back in big playoff moments. He hasn't really had any since that Denver series a few years ago, if I'm remembering correctly, when he had the spiritual experience game, as Kevin Durant called it. So yeah, I still think he's worth acquiring for teams that view themselves as contenders with him, but that contract's probably going to be ugly in the last couple of years.
Yeah. It's the first time I've ever felt like Blazer Nation should be grateful to Steph, because Steph's recent performance has definitely helped Dame's value on the market. Just like our perception of what a mid-30s elite shooting superstar guard can still be. And Dame should probably be a little bit upset with Steph, because it's going to make it harder to deal him to a team that is good when he gets there, because Portland's going to ask for so much. Okay, let me just drop a quick bomb on you. Staying in the Dame lane, but tethering it to Jaylen Brown. If their contracts lined up and Jaylen talked to the Portland's front office and said, yeah, I'm down for the extension, would you trade Dame for Jaylen Brown straight up?
Yes, I would. If I'm Portland, yes.
If you're Portland. And on Boston's end?
I think Jaylen Brown has a little more trade value, or should have a little more trade value, because of his age. And, positional flexibility. Dame, for as great as he is, does introduce some like roster building challenges where you have to have the right pieces around him to cover for his defensive deficiencies. But obviously, offensively is absolute dynamite, and Boston does have the size around him where they'd be able to cover for some of that. So I can see both teams doing it. I do think in a vacuum, because of age, Jaylen has more trade value. I feel like higher on Jaylen than consensus after these playoffs, where it feels like a lot of people have kind of gotten low on him after the Miami series and sort of his turnover issues and things like that. And a lot of the same things popping up that popped up in the finals last year. But I still think he's worth taking a flyer on. Like, how old is he even? He might be younger than Mikal Bridges. Yeah,
he is.
So Mikal Bridges, I looked up, is 26 also, but Jaylen Brown, he's 26. Yeah. So
yeah,
I think,
and if we're gonna clown on Jaylen for this most recent playoff exit, we also got to give him his flowers for the finals before that, because I think most would agree he was the best player on the Celtics in that finals. Obviously, different role for Jason Tatum, the same way it's like Jimmy versus Caleb Martin. Like, there's always one wing that takes on the biggest burden, but Jaylen was amazing in those playoffs and like had some incredible moments. Game 6, Tatum in Milwaukee is what we remember, but Jaylen was great against the Bucks as well. Obviously, his handle has always had been his Achilles heel, but he has so many strengths. He's still young. That athleticism should last another several years. I agree with you. I remember a couple of years ago after a really ugly Utah exit when I vouched for Donovan Mitchell. I kind of feel like Jaylen Brown is around that territory now. I think because he's a wing and he's at least shown flashes of really high level playoff defense. This isn't like Donovan Mitchell level rock bottom value at all. Like you just said it yourself. You probably wouldn't trade him for Dame as the Celtics. But a lot of teams have the assets to go and get Jaylen Brown if they feel like they can re-sign him and have him long term.
Yeah. Well, here's a question for you. If you're going more the route of trading Dame for a young star, would you
Yeah.
rather get Jaylen Brown or Brandon Ingram?
I think Brandon Ingram is a couple of years younger, maybe one. I think
I mean, they were the same draft class. He's 25.
Yeah.
He's 1 year younger.
Yeah. I would rather have Brandon Ingram. I think that Brandon Ingram has a little bit more room to grow.
Mm.
And I think Jaylen Brown's defense took a slight step back last year. So that before this past season, I probably would have taken Jaylen for the two-way ability. I love Ingram's passing, and also Scoot profiles as so many great things. I'm not sure you want him to be like your end of shot clock in the playoffs guy, at least not for a while. And Brandon Ingram has already made some big shots. Obviously, he hasn't made a deep playoff run, but I have a lot of faith in him. When he was going back and forth with the SGA last year, even though even though I think SGA probably was the story of that matchup, I just gained a lot of respect for Brandon Ingram. His game continues to grow, and I'm not sure that he's reached his peak yet. But also, neither of those guys is quite on the Shaedon Scoot timeline, which is fine. Like, I can't start saying 25 is too old for the Blazers, but
yeah,
I would like to see more teams show some real courage and pinpoint a guy like Kobe Buffkin, like Alperen Şengün, like Anthony Black, someone who's very unproven in the league, but maybe your team, your scouting department just believes this guy is an all-star. And like, if you pay dozens of guys year round to evaluate young talent, whether it's college, abroad, NBA, like surely you have someone on your board that you think is the next Halliburton, who's just sitting somewhere, whether it's Trey Murphy in New Orleans, or I mentioned Şengün. He's one of those guys. Maybe you think Jalen Green isn't super high on Houston's list of priorities, but you think Jalen Green can turn into a superstar in the next couple of years. Like, I think that is like the next frontier of NBA team building. And I'm surprised that so many of the trades we see floated around are just like the usual suspects. Like, Jaylen Brown, part of a 3-teamer, Siakam to the Blazers was a rumor for a while. I doubt there was much behind it, but it was a thing. Let's see. I mean, it's all the usual suspects: OG Anunoby, Gary Trent Jr. These are guys. I'm just listing Raptors, but it's been usual suspects in trade talks for a while, and I wonder why more often we don't see a team say, as scary as it is, and as much shit as we might take from our fan base in the early going, like maybe we should dump Dame to the Magic for a bunch of young assets that we think could one or two of them could be really special. That might be the way to actually win a trade where you're losing your best player ever.
Yeah. Well, I do, funny enough, kind of have a trade like that. And quickly to close the loop on the New Orleans one, I think it's an interesting idea for New Orleans. It'd be a big swing to switch BI for Dame, but you'd kind of be building the Dame CJ Blazers again, just with actually athletic wings who can both play defense and shoot threes. And Zion, you'd have to have faith in Zion long term for that trade to be worth it. You could also do the trade for Zion instead of Brandon Ingram, but if you have Dame, CJ, and then you're still holding on to Herb Jones and Trey Murphy, Dyson Daniels to kind of cover up for some of their defense, and then introduce the Zion sort of chaos element into it. It's interesting, at least. But I do have one more trade for Dame. I mean, I have one to OKC where it's just like Case and Wallace, salary filler, and a bunch of picks. But
Case is another guy. I'm not so high on Case and ceiling, but like surely there's someone in the league that had Kaysen in their top 7 or so. I had him at 7, but I don't see him as a potential star. I just see him as an elite role player.
Yeah.
But like pick a guy like that, attach him to some picks, and take on some bad contracts like Davis Bertans, and just line up the money and take a swing on a young guy. That's what I'm advocating for.
Yeah. Okay, so I have another trade where Portland gets kind of one of those guys you were talking about where he's not someone who's bandied about all that often. And this one gets a little weird. So Dame's going to Minnesota. Karl Anthony Towns is going to Cleveland,
Oh,
where
thank God you scared me.
Karl Anthony Towns is going to Cleveland, where Evan Mobley will be working overtime to cover for his defensive mistakes. But we saw in the playoffs that Allen Mobley front line is just too anemic offensively.
Yeah.
So it's possible that pairing Mobley with Cat can kind of allow both to cover for the other's deficiencies. And it's maybe a better big pairing for both of them than the ones that they're currently in. So Minnesota gets Dame to pair with Anthony Edwards and Gobert. Towns goes to Cleveland, and then Portland gets Jared Allen, Jaden McDaniels, and Filler. So Jaden McDaniels is a name where like he's a guy who, NBA nerd Twitter is very in love with because of his defense, but then his offense has really started to come around this year as well, both his shooting and a little bit of creation off the bounce. Jared Allen is, former All-Star center on a decent contract. I'm sure if you don't like him in Portland, there's teams you can trade him to for a first-round pick, I'm sure, but he'd also be a good screen and roll partner for Scoot Henderson and someone to kind of shore up the defense early on in Scoot and Shaden's career. So actually, I really like this one because I think it solves problems for Cleveland. I think Portland getting Allen and McDaniels are two really sort of high-value young pieces. And Dame would have to sign off, or he wouldn't have to sign off, but he'd have to go to Minnesota, which him and Anthony Edwards would be a pretty sick backcourt to watch. And it kind of might help Minnesota get out of this predicament they've put themselves in with the Gobert Cat situation. And then Naz Reid gets some more minutes too as a bonus.
Yeah.
But that's a trade that'll probably never happen, but I thought made a lot of sense for all three teams.
I really like for Jared Allen the role of like defensive anchor, be the rock of a young upstart team, especially after the way he faded in round one against the Knicks last year. If he's not ready to be a playoff anchor, especially with a team whose future is a guy who probably should play the 5 in Evan Mobley as he puts on more weight, I like it. Again, another adult in the room to have with Scoot and Shaden. I have no problem with that. McDaniels is also a guy who is probably better than his contract will ever communicate. And those guys are great to have. Like he's like the young Anunoby in the sense that he should probably make more money than he does because defense is his number one asset. And that's a perfect thing to put around a bunch of young, presumably poor defenders as we build this thing from the ground up.
Yeah. All right. That was my last Dame trade. Do you have any more Dame ones? You want to move to somebody else?
Let's move to somebody else. I'm thinking Harden because the Clippers are the only team that I can talk myself into in terms of getting Harden and actually potentially being better in the playoffs. I would not want my team in the Harden business under any circumstances. I would rather pay Patrick Beverley $40 million than James Harden. That's just a me thing. But obviously there are suitors, and the Clippers seem to be the most mentioned team. And I see why. I don't know how you could win any series with Russ and Harden on the same roster, but you know what? Ty Lue's done crazier shit than that. So yeah, talk to me about your favorite Harden possibilities.
Yeah, I was also looking at the teams, and the Clippers are really the only team that makes sense. Like, even the Knicks were thrown about at first, but honestly, I think that was just Philly trying to drum up a market. Like, the Knicks came out pretty quickly and sort of stated they weren't that interested in that, or sort of that noise has cooled down a lot. He's someone who also doesn't make much sense with Brunson because we like Brunson doing the ball handling in New York, and that backcourt is extremely flammable defensively. So, I mean, if it's going to be the Clippers, it's going to be some combination of their bench guys, or their rotation pieces, where Philly's going to get a deeper rotation in exchange for Harden, and the Clippers are going to sort of try to consolidate into a 3-star team. If you still consider Harden a star, which I in the regular season, he certainly is. In the playoffs, remains to be seen. But some combination of Nick Batum, Norm Powell, if Philly gets persuasive, Terrence Mann, but seems like the Clippers are pretty reluctant to move off him, Marcus Morris, just some combination of all of those $10 to $15 million contracts until you get to Harden's number, where the Sixers get 3 rotation wings and the Clippers get Harden. And that's kind of the only trade out there that makes sense, which isn't ideal for the Sixers, because then you're rolling out with basically Embiid as your only star and hoping for a pretty meteoric rise from Tyrese Maxey, which he may be capable of, but then you're kind of left without a lead ball handler on that team. And for all of Harden's foibles, one thing he was good at was throwing entry passes to Embiid, which Maxey, I don't think, is very good at. So you'd have to find some guys on the team who could just get the ball to Embiid in the post. But that's a minor quibble. For those reasons, I don't know if the trade honestly ends up happening, but that's the only trade that made sense to me.
Speaking of these two teams, I mentioned earlier how I'd love for my team to absorb Ben Simmons' contract because he's probably just coming with a lot of good stuff to offset his negative value.
Yeah.
I don't want to be one of the teams trading for Terrence Mann or Tyrese Maxey because the two TMs, because the Clippers and the Sixers respectively have made it so clear how highly they value those guys. And I just feel like if you're going to pry them away, you're probably paying way too much of a premium. But I like that deal for the Sixers. I'm just so anti James Harden that I'd rather have Tyler Herro than James Harden. So most of the deals that get the Sixers anything in return for Harden's money, in my mind, is a win for Daryl Morey.
Yeah, and you can double down on creating like an elite defense around Embiid and just having him. Ironically enough, it would be sort of the Allen Iverson model where it's just like a go-to scorer and then a bunch of defensive pieces around it. But instead of your scorer being a 5'11" guard, it's this 7'1" sort of athletic freak of a big man. But then you just surround him with like Powell, Batum, PJ Tucker, Marcus Morris, and then Maxey to sort of create some excitement. It's an interesting construct for a team at the very least.
How much do you value DeAndre Ayton as of July 5th, 2023?
I tried really hard to make Ayton trades, and really the only one that makes a little bit of sense is Charlotte. A lot of teams just like have center prospects that they like, and Ayton is like a perfectly fine center, but he's getting paid like an all-star, and he might be an all-star. He's still very young. He might make an all-star team or an injury replacement or something. But I was just going through the teams and Cleveland, they showed that like a non-stretch big with Mobley doesn't make a ton of sense. Maybe the Knicks, but like they're kind of okay with Mitchell Robinson. The Hawks, maybe if they want to do some like Clint Capella, DeAndre Hunter package, that could be a thing. I kept coming back to Charlotte for PJ Washington and Terry Rozier, which I like Mark Williams a lot for Charlotte. I had him pretty high in last year's draft. I think he can be a really good defensive center, but if they aren't super high on him, want to add someone with a little bit more scoring punch at that position, I guess an Ayton trade would make sense. And then Phoenix, who, after free agency my depth concerns for them are a little bit less, but they still have depth concerns. So if they split that Ayton piece into 2 rotation pieces, that might help them. I don't know. Did you come up with anything compelling for Ayton?
Maybe. I think I sent this one to you earlier, but I came up with a 3-teamer with Phoenix, the Blazers, and the Magic. Because, we've been talking a lot about Dame, but the Blazers are also paying a lot of money to Jeremy Grant and Anthony Simons. And most likely will want to get off of those contracts in the next year or two. Anthony Simons might be in that Tyrese Maxey, Terrence Mann bag of players that the team that has them values them way too much because they drafted them, they've watched them grow. But the Magic need shooting. They just drafted Anthony Black at number 6 when they already have a non-shooting point guard in Markelle Fultz, or an extremely low volume shooting point guard. Paolo Banchero isn't a shooter yet. Franz Wagner's a little bit inconsistent. So maybe the Magic are okay with 3 years, 25 annually for Anthony Simons. Magic fans, please don't send me hate mail. So I have Anthony and Watanabe going to the Magic. The Magic are sending Cole Anthony to the Suns, Gary Harris to the Blazers, Joe Ingles to the Blazers, and then the Blazers are getting Ayton. Ayton, who makes $32 million and has 3 years left on his deal. So basically the Blazers get Ayton, Harris, and Ingles. Basically, they're just absorbing the not so great veteran contracts the Magic have. The Magic get Utah and Anthony, and the Suns get Jeremy Grant and Cole Anthony.
Okay.
Devin Booker gets his backup point guard in Cole Anthony, and Jeremy Grant plays fourth fiddle on a star-laden team. I'm not out here saying this is a call it in for all three teams, but I think all three teams have a conversation about it. Personally, I don't want Anthony Simons on my team if I'm the Magic, but I'm also so jaded as a Blazers fan, seeing the way he just doesn't fit well with Dame. And DeAndre Ayton, like you said, he's getting paid like an all-star. So, if there's any team that should take on that money and see if maybe he's, center Donovan Mitchell, it's the Blazers. Let's take a swing on a distressed asset. I'm not the biggest Ayton guy. I don't love what I hear from people who are plugged in about his intangibles. So I'm not claiming that he's going to break out on his second team and become the all-star that he has the talent to be. But, he's still, what is he? I think he's 24 years old. And
yeah,
it's just a swing I'm willing to take, especially because our main center has been Yusuf Nurkic, and I like Drew Eubanks, who was his switchable second center, and he's gone, and I don't know who the hell is going to be in our front court this year. So maybe Ayton is a good guy to have running with Scoot, and give us a little bit more half court juice as well, since we have like these young athletes that are inefficient in the half court. I don't hate it, and if I'm the Suns, I talk myself into the idea that we have the best roster going into next season.
Yeah, I think that's a solid trade. Simons makes sense for Orlando to try to get some shooting to add to their team. And
yeah,
I hadn't considered Portland as an Ayton team, but that makes sense also to try to take a flyer on him. And they're going to end up having space to burn, assuming they move Dame. So that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
I've got one more.
And also here, the Magic are getting Anthony without giving up Suggs, Anthony Black, Franz Wagner, or Paolo. Not even Wendell. Like none of their good contracts are going out there. They are just sacrificing depth to get one of the best shooters in the NBA, who will hopefully be protected by their stronger defenders. All right, yeah, hit me.
All right. Do you want to hear a weird one?
Please.
This is a Towns trade.
Oh, great.
The teams I kept coming back to that made a little bit of sense for Towns were Cleveland and Atlanta. And then I'm also working Boston into this because there's some noise that they might want to move Brogdon with concerns about his health. So here's one where Atlanta gets Towns. Boston gets Conley as sort of a Brogdon replacement to stabilize their guard rotation a little bit. Mm-hmm. And then Minnesota gets Brogdon along with DeAndre Hunter and DeJounte Murray. So it's basically Atlanta's trading Hunter and DeJounte for Towns, and then there's a Conley-Brogdon swap involved in there as well. I kind of like that for all three teams. I think Minnesota, DeJounte and Edwards can be an absolutely hellacious defensive backcourt. And it kind of solves their positional glut at the big position. And I like Conley more than Brogdon as a stabilizing force for Boston. I think he's kind of exactly the veteran, intelligent presence that they need. And then Atlanta gets Cat, and teams will flambe them in the Trae Young Cat pick and roll on defense. And maybe their offense can be elite with sort of that spacing. But, I thought that might be worth a shot.
So funny to me how different guys just have fetishes for making fake trades with different teams. Like, obviously, I'm obsessed with the Blazers right now because their roster's in flux and Dame just requested a trade. Obviously, you'd be messing around with the Knicks more if they weren't in this sort of healthy upper middle class moment where it'll be a bad thing if they mortgage their future for one of these disgruntled stars. And so the Timberwolves just keep coming back to your heart and soul. And I really like that deal. I'm just one of the freaks who probably likes DeAndre Hunter more than Karl Anthony Towns. So I'm scared giving up DeAndre Hunter at this point in his trajectory because it feels like his career is stalled. And so maybe you're cutting your losses, but maybe you're quitting on a guy who still has more to show.
Yeah, this could also, for Atlanta, be a trade where DeJounte's contract is expiring after this season. And if they don't, he's going to be unrestricted free agent summer of 2024. So if they don't think he's going to stick around, then that could be an asset that they use to get Towns and before they lose him for nothing.
Do you believe that Towns can be reformed into like a winning player? Or do you think that we have the full download on Karl Anthony Towns as a person?
I don't think you can build a good defense around him or that includes him, which I think by default means you probably won't be a winning player. So that's why I went to Cleveland because, if anyone can do it, maybe it's Evan Mobley, who's one of the better defensive prospects we've seen. But I would probably default to no, and he's not a positive asset on the contract that he's currently on.
Yeah, if Walker Kessler didn't pop so much as a rookie, and it looks like the Jazz just have their center of the future, like Taylor Hendricks is another guy who could cover for a lackluster rim protector like Cat. Might have been interesting if Walker Kessler just didn't happen. It might have been interesting to see Cat go to a situation like that, like a just full factory reset on a team with a guy who can protect the rim next to him, and and just a bunch of young talent that views him as the focal point, because Cat is still an efficient scorer. The question is, does he make good decisions in the playoffs? Does he defend enough for his position in the playoffs? And the answer for a few years now has been no.
Yeah, I thought of Memphis as well with Jaren to kind of try to cover for some of his mistakes, but Memphis is in such a good spot right now that might be a bit too drastic of a change for them to consider.
Yeah.
So, and he doesn't really seem like he fits with their culture necessarily, but considered that, although he and Jaren Jackson might both foul out in the first half of a playoff game.
With Anthony Edwards' tools and just like his increasing level of care for the defensive end, he could also become an elite defender if they got Cat out of there. I saw a really interesting tweet the other day just about how like we don't take enough into account how much easier it is to be like a young perimeter defender like Desmond Bane with Steven Adams and Jaren Jackson behind you, as opposed to, I don't know, Anthony Edwards, who before Gobert got there was, only protected by Karl Anthony Towns, which isn't saying much. It's just a drastically different foundation you have as a perimeter defender. And and also Gobert can do what he does best without another 7-footer bogging things down for them in the post.
Yeah, that's my favorite trade for Minnesota. If they have Murray, Edwards, McDaniels, and Gobert, that could be like the best defense in the NBA. So throw whatever picks at Atlanta you need to make it happen, because I need to rescue Anthony.
Who under 23 would you want as the blue chip face of a trade, a Dame trade, if you're Portland? Just give me one name and then we'll get out of here. And it can't be CD Sissoko.
I'll say if you can get Scotty Barnes, I think make it happen.
It's been the Boris Dirk podcast. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back soon. Peace.